There is a specific kind of isolation that comes with staying up all night staring at a glowing screen. A few years ago, I was trying to get a freelance business off the ground. I lived alone in a cheap, ground-floor apartment, and my sleep schedule was completely inverted. I would wake up at noon and work straight through until the sun came up. I preferred it that way. No emails, no texts, no traffic outside. Just me and the work. It was a Tuesday in late November. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and the wind was rattling the cheap glass of my apartment windows. It was around 3:30 a.m. I was sitting at my desk, deep into a heavy video editing session. When you edit for hours on end, you get tunnel vision. I had my heavy, noise-canceling headphones clamped over my ears, hyper-focused on the audio waveforms on my timeline. My desk was pushed up against the wall, meaning my back was completely exposed to the rest of the apartment. To my right was a large window that looked out into the narrow, concrete side alley of my building. The plastic blinds were pulled down, but they were old and slightly warped, leaving a few thin gaps. Around 4 a.m., my eyes started to burn. I exported the project, pulled my headphones off, and let out a long breath, rubbing the tension out of my neck. Taking off noise-canceling headphones after wearing them for hours is a strange sensation. The sudden return of the room's natural acoustics always feels a little disorienting. I sat there for a moment, listening to the low hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, I noticed the light. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pale, yellow glow seeping through the warped gaps in my blinds. The motion sensor security floodlight in the alleyway had been triggered. I didn't immediately panic. It was an alleyway. Stray cats and raccoons set that light off all the time. I took a sip of my cold coffee and waited for the timer to tick down and the light to shut off. A full minute passed. The light stayed on, which meant whatever was out there was still moving. I felt a sudden, irrational prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I stood up from my desk, my chair squeaking slightly against the floorboards. I walked quietly over to the window and pressed my face against the glass, peering through the narrowest slit in the plastic blinds. Standing dead center in the illuminated alleyway, completely motionless, was a man. He wasn't walking past. He wasn't digging through the dumpsters. He was just standing there in a filthy, oversized winter coat, staring directly at my window. My stomach dropped. Because of the angle of the light, I couldn't make out his facial features, but I could see his posture. It was unnaturally rigid. He knew exactly which apartment he was looking at. I held my breath, terrified that any movement would give me away. I watched him slowly raise his right arm. Clutched in his gloved hand was a heavy, rusted pair of industrial bolt cutters. He didn't step toward my window. Instead, he took 2 slow steps backward, fading out of the floodlight's reach and disappearing into the pitch-black shadows near the back of the building. 3 seconds later, my monitors went completely black. The hum of the refrigerator died. The heater cut out. I was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. He hadn't just tripped a breaker. He had cut the main power line to my specific unit. Absolute panic seized my chest. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling frantically across the dark carpet toward my bed, where my phone was charging. I unplugged it, my hands shaking so violently I dropped it twice before I could dial emergency services. I crawled into the narrow gap between my bed frame and the wall, pressing the phone to my ear. As it began to ring, I heard a sound that I will never, ever forget. It was the slow, agonizing screech of metal scraping against metal, coming from the kitchen. He was prying open the security screen on my back window. I whispered my address to the 911 operator, tears of pure terror stinging my eyes. I heard the heavy thud of boots landing on my linoleum kitchen floor. He was inside. The police arrived in under 4 minutes. Their heavy pounding on my front door sent the intruder scrambling back out the window before he ever made it to my bedroom. By the time the officers breached the apartment with their flashlights, the place was empty. All he left behind was a trail of muddy footprints leading from the kitchen window, stopping just inches from the threshold of the dark hallway where I was hiding. If you have ever driven alone on a long, empty stretch of highway in the middle of the night, you know what highway hypnosis feels like. The rhythmic flashing of the dotted white lines, the endless darkness just beyond your headlights, the low hum of the tires on the asphalt. Your brain essentially goes on autopilot. I was 22, driving back to my college town after spending the weekend visiting my parents. It was a 5-hour drive, and I had left way too late. By 2 a.m., I was navigating a desolate, heavily wooded stretch of rural highway. There were no streetlights, no rest stops, and I hadn't seen another pair of headlights in over 40 minutes. To make matters worse, a thick, freezing fog had rolled out of the tree line, cutting my visibility down to almost nothing. My high beams were useless, reflecting off the mist like a solid white wall. I turned the radio down to focus, gripping the steering wheel tight. About 10 miles into the worst of the fog, I saw a faint, pulsing orange glow up ahead. As I cautiously approached, the shape of a vehicle materialized on the muddy shoulder of the road. It was an older, dark-colored sedan. The hazard lights were blinking rhythmically through the mist. Standing just off the asphalt, waving her arms frantically at my approaching headlights, was a young woman. My immediate instinct was to hit the brakes. It was freezing cold, miles from civilization, and she looked completely stranded. I checked my rearview mirror. The road behind me was an empty black void. I eased my car over onto the shoulder, coming to a stop about 20 feet behind her bumper. I didn't turn my engine off. I kept my foot resting lightly on the brake pedal, and I made sure all my doors were locked.
Please.
She gasped, her voice desperate and out of breath.
My car just completely died. My phone has no signal out here. Can you please let me in? I just need a ride to the next town.
Her body language was frantic, but as I looked into her eyes, a heavy, sinking feeling hit the pit of my stomach. Her eyes were dead. They were completely calm, cold, and calculating. They didn't match the desperate panic in her voice at all. It was like I was watching someone perform a poorly rehearsed play. My survival instincts screamed at me. I broke eye contact and looked past her, analyzing her car. The hazard lights were flashing, but the tires looked perfectly fine. And then, in the red glow of my taillights, I noticed the exhaust pipe of her sedan. In the freezing night air, there was a steady, thick stream of white vapor billowing out of the tailpipe. Her car hadn't died. The engine was currently running. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I can't let you in, but I will drive up to the next town and call the police to come tow you." The instant those words left my mouth, the fake, panicked expression vanished from her face. It was entirely replaced by a look of sheer, seething anger. She didn't say another word. She just took a slow step backward, melting into the fog. At that exact moment, my peripheral vision caught a shift in the shadows directly behind my car. I snapped my eyes to my rearview mirror. Illuminated entirely by the glow of my brake lights, I saw two massive men silently stepping out of the dense tree line. They were making a direct line for the back of my vehicle. One of them was holding something heavy and metallic that glinted in the red light. They were already within 5 feet of my bumper. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. My tires spun violently in the wet mud for a terrifying second before the rubber finally caught the asphalt. The car lurched forward, throwing me back in my seat. I looked in my rearview mirror one last time as I sped away. Through the fog, I saw the two men step out into the middle of the empty highway, standing completely still side by side, watching me disappear. I drove 20 miles over the speed limit until I reached a brightly lit, 24-hour truck stop. I called the police from the safety of the fluorescent lights. They dispatched a cruiser, but when the officers arrived at that mile marker, the shoulder was completely... When you live completely alone, you become intimately familiar with the unique sounds of your house. You know the specific creak of the hallway floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the pipes shudder when you turn off the faucet. A few years ago, I rented a small, single-story house on the deep outskirts of town. It was incredibly cheap, surrounded by overgrown woods, and intensely quiet. During the first month, the quiet was peaceful. But by the second month, small, unexplainable things began to disrupt my routine. I would buy groceries, and a few days later, a sleeve of crackers or a bottle of water would be missing. I would leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them sitting on the coffee table the next morning. It was never anything valuable, just small, subtle displacements. I told myself I was just stressed and forgetful. When you live alone, there is no one else to blame for misplaced items, so you gaslight yourself into accepting it. Then, the smell began. It started faintly in the hallway outside my bedroom. A stale, sour odor, like unwashed clothes, old sweat, and damp dust. I scrubbed the carpets and sprayed air freshener, but the smell seemed to seep directly from the walls. The layout of the house was simple. My bedroom door opened directly into a short, narrow hallway. Directly above that hallway, set into the ceiling, was a square wooden panel. It was the access hatch to the attic. It didn't have a pull-down ladder. It was just a heavy piece of drywall resting in a wooden frame. One night, a massive thunderstorm rolled through the valley. The rain was hammering against the roof so violently that it drowned out almost every other sound in the house. I was lying in bed, wide awake. I had left the hallway light on, casting a bright, yellow sliver of light beneath my closed bedroom door. Through the heavy drumming of the rain, my ears picked up a sound that didn't belong. It was the distinct, gritty sound of wood scraping against wood. It was coming directly from the ceiling in the hallway. I lay completely paralyzed beneath my blankets. My eyes were locked onto the crack of light beneath my bedroom door. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing, just the deafening sound of the rain against the glass. Then, the light under my door was eclipsed by two dark shadows. Someone was standing in my hallway, just inches away from me. Through the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the carpet, I could see them. Two bare, filthy feet. Whoever it was stood completely motionless. They weren't pacing. They weren't searching the house. They were just standing there, facing the thin wood of my door, listening to me breathe. A wave of pure nausea washed over me as the horrifying truth finally clicked into place. The missing food, the displaced items, the sour smell. Someone had been living in my attic, coming down when I was at work, eating my food, walking through my living room. And now, they were standing outside my door while I was trapped in bed. I watched the dirty feet shift slightly. The toes pointed directly toward my doorknob. I saw the shadow of a hand reach down, blocking more of the light. They were grabbing the handle. I didn't think. I reacted on pure, blinding adrenaline. I rolled out of bed, hit the floor, and scrambled toward my bedroom window. I tore the latch open, shoved the glass up, and threw myself out into the pouring rain. I landed hard in the mud, scrambled to my feet, and sprinted blindly down the street until I reached a neighbor's porch, pounding on their door until they let me in. When the police arrived, they drew their weapons and breached the front door. They searched the main floor. It was empty, but when they pushed a stepladder up to the hallway ceiling and pushed the access panel aside, they found the nightmare. Nestled in the pink insulation directly above my bedroom was a makeshift camp. There was a filthy sleeping bag, dozens of empty food wrappers from my kitchen, and bottles filled with dark urine. But the detail that still keeps me awake at night wasn't the sleeping bag. Directly above where my bed was positioned, the intruder had used a pocket knife to carve a tiny, dime-sized hole through the floorboards of the attic and through the drywall of my ceiling. He hadn't just been living above me. He had been lying on his stomach in the dark, watching me sleep. Every single night. Liminal spaces are environments that are meant to be full of people, but are completely abandoned. An empty mall, a school hallway at midnight, a deserted parking garage. When you are alone in a liminal space, your brain starts to play tricks on you. It expects movement where there is none. I used to work the night audit shift at a cheap, independent motel right off an interstate highway. During the off-season, the place was practically a ghost town. It was a sprawling, single-story property shaped like a massive U, with all the exterior room doors facing a massive, poorly lit parking lot. My job was to sit in the small front office behind bulletproof glass from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The office was cramped and smelled constantly of burnt coffee and old carpet. My only company was a bank of 4 grainy, black and white security monitors mounted on the wall above the desk. Camera 1 showed the front lobby. Camera 2 showed the vending machines. Camera 3 showed the left wing of the rooms. Camera 4 showed the right wing, stretching far out into the darkness near the dumpsters. It was a Tuesday night in mid-October. A heavy, freezing drizzle was falling outside, making the asphalt slick and reflective under the flickering orange street lamps. We had exactly 3 guests checked in, all of them long-haul truckers sleeping off the drive. Around 2:30 a.m., I was fighting to keep my eyes open, reading a paperback book behind the counter. The absolute silence of the motel was deafening. I casually glanced up at the bank of security monitors. On camera 4, at the very edge of the frame, right where the light from the building gave way to the pitch black of the woods behind the property, something was moving. I put my book down and squinted at the screen. The cameras were old and the resolution was terrible, but I could clearly make out the silhouette of a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing the building, getting soaked in the freezing rain. I figured it was a drunk guest who had wandered out for a smoke and gotten disoriented. I watched the screen for 5 minutes, waiting for them to move. They didn't. They just stood there, a dark smear of pixels against the rain. I looked down to take a sip of my coffee. When I looked back up at the monitors, the figure on camera 4 was gone. I exhaled, feeling a slight knot of tension release in my stomach. They must have gone back to their room. 30 minutes later, the silence of the lobby was broken by a soft, metallic clink. I jumped in my chair. The sound had come from outside the bulletproof glass, out in the courtyard. I looked up at the monitors. Camera 3, the left wing. The figure was there, but they weren't standing still anymore. They were systematically walking down the exterior walkway, stopping at every single guest door. They would grab the heavy metal door handle, pull down hard, test the lock, and move to the next one. There was a blind spot, a massive one. The cameras covered the courtyard and the walkways, but there was no camera covering the narrow, dark alleyway that ran directly behind the front office. The alleyway that led to the heavy steel door at the back of my workspace. The moment that realization hit me, the hair on my arm stood up. Behind me, in the tiny, windowless back office, the heavy steel door let out a loud, agonizing groan. Clink! The heavy metal handle had been pulled down. The lock clicked, holding firm. I froze, entirely paralyzed, staring at the closed door that separated the front desk from the back room. There was a long, terrifying pause, and then the handle began to rattle. Violently. Whoever was on the other side of that steel door wasn't just testing it anymore. They were throwing their entire body weight against it, trying to break the locking mechanism. The heavy steel door buckled inward slightly with every impact. Bang! 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 I backed away from the door until my spine hit the bulletproof glass of the front desk, trapping myself. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening to the metal warp and groan. Suddenly, the parking lot was bathed in strobing red and blue lights. The police cruiser had pulled off the highway. The second the lights hit the front of the building, the violent pounding against the back door stopped instantly. I heard the frantic slap of wet boots sprinting down the alleyway and crashing through the brush into the woods. The police searched the property with flashlights for an hour, but the man had vanished into the tree line. I quit my job the moment the sun came up. I never worked a night shift again, because every time I look at a camera feed, I don't look at what the camera is showing me. I look at all the dark spaces the camera can't see. There is nothing quite as isolating as deep winter in the mountains. When the snow piles up high enough, it acts as acoustic insulation. It absorbs sound, making the world feel incredibly small, muffled, and entirely cut off from the rest of humanity. A few years ago, I booked a small, secluded A-frame cabin for a solo riding retreat. It was located deep in a heavily wooded valley, accessed only by a narrow, winding dirt road that took 30 minutes to navigate. I arrived on a Friday afternoon just as a massive blizzard was beginning to dump snow onto the valley. By nightfall, there was easily 2 feet of powder on the ground. My car was completely snowed in, and my cell phone signal was reduced to a single, fluctuating bar. I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I had paid for. I built a roaring fire in the wood stove, locked the heavy deadbolt on the front door, and spent the evening reading. The first night passed without incident. When I woke up on Saturday morning, the storm had broken. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue, and the snow was pristine and untouched. I decided to make a cup of coffee and step out onto the wraparound wooden deck to take in the absolute silence. I walked out the front door, pulling my heavy coat tight around myself. The air was so cold it burned my lungs. I walked to the edge of the deck and looked down at the snow covering the yard. My breath caught in my throat. Cutting through the pristine, unbroken blanket of white snow was a single set of deep footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were large, heavy boot prints. They emerged from the dense, dark tree line at the edge of the property, walked in a perfectly straight line toward the cabin, and stopped directly beneath the living room window. The window where I had been sitting and reading the night before. The footprints stood there for a while. The snow trampled down heavily in one spot, before turning around and walking back out into the woods, disappearing into the dark pines. A heavy, sickening wave of paranoia washed over me. Someone had walked out of the freezing woods in the middle of a blizzard, stood in the 2-foot deep snow, and watched me through the glass. I rushed back inside and locked the door. I checked every window latch. I pulled every curtain shut. I tried to call the owner of the cabin, but the storm had knocked out my single bar of cell service. I was completely, utterly trapped until the snowplow cleared the mountain road, which wasn't scheduled until Monday. I spent Saturday in a state of hypervigilance. I kept the lights off, letting the fire provide the only illumination. I jumped at every creak of the settling wood. I didn't sleep a wink that night, sitting in a chair facing the front door with a heavy iron fire poker resting across my lap. Sunday morning finally arrived. The sun came up, casting long, stark shadows across the snow. I had to know. I had to look. I slowly unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the freezing deck. I looked over the railing, praying to see an empty yard. My heart plummeted into my stomach. There were new footprints, but this time, they didn't just walk up to the living room window. The new set of heavy boot prints emerged from the exact same spot in the woods. They walked up to the side of the cabin, and then they began to circle the entire perimeter of the house. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They dragged slowly through the deep snow, brushing right up against the wooden siding. They stopped at the kitchen window. They stopped at the bathroom window. They stopped at the back door. And then, I noticed the most terrifying detail of all. The tracks didn't lead back into the woods. They circled the house, came around to the front deck stairs, and walked up onto the wood. I stumbled backward, my eyes frantically tracing the wet, muddy boot prints stamped directly onto the wooden planks of the deck. They led from the top of the stairs, straight toward the front door I was currently standing in. I looked down. The muddy prints stopped exactly 2 inches from my boots. Whoever it was had stood on the deck, in the pitch black, with their face practically pressed against the wood of the door, listening to me sit on the other side. And they were still somewhere on the property. I ran inside, slammed the deadbolt shut, and barricaded the door with the heavy oak dining table. I spent the next 24 hours trapped in the bathroom, the only room in the cabin without windows, holding that fire poker until my hands cramped. When the snowplow finally crested the hill on Monday afternoon, I didn't even pack my bags. I grabbed my keys, sprinted through the snow to my car, and drove down the mountain without looking back. I never found out who was in the woods. The police investigated, but by the time they got up there, the sun had melted the tracks into unidentifiable slush. But I know what they were doing. They weren't trying to break in. Not yet. They were testing the perimeter. They were waiting for me to get comfortable. And if the plow hadn't arrived when it did, I know they wouldn't have just stood on the porch on the third night. There is a very specific type of isolation that exists deep underground. A few years ago, I took a job at a local university library. I wasn't working at the circulation desk. I was hired for a massive, multi-year archival project. The university was digitizing decades of old physical media, VHS tapes, 16mm film reels, and microfiche, transferring them onto secure hard drives. Because physical media degrades in heat and humidity, the archive was located in the sub-basement of the oldest building on campus. It was a windowless, climate-controlled concrete bunker. The walls were thick, and the heavy, fireproof doors sealed shut behind you. Once you were inside, you couldn't hear the weather, you couldn't hear the students, and your cell phone lost all reception. My shift was from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. The work was incredibly tedious. I would load a tape, press play, and monitor the digital capture on a pair of bright monitors, wearing heavy studio headphones to listen for audio clipping. For 8 hours a night, my entire world was reduced to the glowing rectangles on my desk. It was a Thursday night during the university's winter break. The campus was completely deserted. I had been sitting in the basement for about 5 hours, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors. I grabbed the next VHS tape from the plastic bin. It was completely unmarked. No label, no date, no barcode. I slid it into the heavy VCR deck and clicked the capture button on my software. The screen flickered with heavy tracking static for a few seconds before the image finally stabilized. It wasn't a university lecture. It was amateur camcorder footage. The video was dark and incredibly grainy. It took my tired eyes a moment to register what I was looking at. The camera was moving, held by someone walking slowly down a paved sidewalk. The only sound coming through my headphones was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the person holding the camera and the crunch of their boots on dry leaves. As the camera panned up, my stomach tied itself into a cold, tight knot. I recognized the architecture. It was the exterior of the university library, the exact building I was currently sitting underneath. I sat frozen in my chair, watching the screen. The person holding the camera walked up to the heavy glass front doors of the library. They reached out with a gloved hand and pulled. The doors were unlocked. They stepped inside. The lobby was completely dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. A wave of pure dread washed over me as I realized the date stamped in the bottom right corner of the camcorder footage. It wasn't from the 1990s. The date was today. The timestamp was 1:15 a.m., exactly 45 minutes ago. I couldn't look away from the monitor. Through my headphones, the heavy breathing grew slightly louder. The camera moved methodically across the dark lobby, heading directly for the back stairwell. The stairwell that led down to the sub-basement. I watched the first-person perspective slowly descend the concrete stairs. The camera reached the bottom of the stairs and turned down the long, narrow cinder block hallway. The hallway that only led to one room. The archive room. On the monitor, the person walked right up to the heavy, fireproof door of my room. They stopped. The camera slowly tilted up, focusing perfectly on the small, reinforced wire glass window set into the center of the door. Through that small window on the tape, I could see the back of my own head, wearing my headphones, staring at the monitors. And then, the footage cut to black-white noise. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently it physically hurt. I ripped the headphones off my ears, plunging myself into the dead silence of the real room. I slowly turned my chair around to face the heavy fireproof door behind me. Standing on the other side of the small, wire-glass window, staring directly back at me, was a man in a dark winter coat. He had a digital camcorder pressed to the glass. I scrambled backward, knocking my chair over, screaming for him to get away. The man didn't flinch. He just slowly lowered the camera, reached out, and wrapped his hand around the heavy iron lever of the door handle. He pushed down. I had locked the deadbolt when I came in at 8 p.m. The handle hit the lock with a loud, metallic clank. It held. The man stared at me through the glass for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, he simply turned and walked back down the concrete hallway, disappearing into the dark. I huddled under my desk, clutching a heavy metal tape reel, until the morning staff arrived at 7 a.m. The campus police reviewed the security cameras upstairs, but the library's exterior cameras had been spray-painted black earlier that night. Someone had slipped into the building, recorded themselves hunting me down, and managed to slide the tape into my unsorted bin when I took a bathroom break. I never went back down into that basement.